Okay, hear ye, hear ye. Please take your seats.
This year is our 100th anniversary of our center.
I know you're tired. I realize my father's already complained about sitting too much. I hear you, believe me. I have a desk job. I know what it's like. But we're only here for a short amount of time. I'm trying to keep the trains running on time, which is always a challenge. Our next panel, session 5, is energy transition and national security. And just to tee this off, so this gets us into, we're going to zoom out from Pennsylvania and then go back out into the international realm. This is an area I've spent a lot of time in terms of national security, but we also have a lot of international visitors, those whose origins come from outside the United States. And I just wanted to point out as an intro and a thank you to Ken Moriyasu, who's a Washington correspondent now for Nikkei Asia. Ken is now an official repeat moderator, and he's a fantastic one. You're going to find out in a minute. But in honor of Ken, Ken is an American, but of Japanese origin. I just had a chance to go to Japan and spend some time there, and we had an absolutely wonderful time. We talked about this conference and talked about energy and national security. And lo and behold, I went to the local antique shop and found this banner over here. This was made by a Japanese exchange student at Titusville who came here sometime, they said, in the 1950s. And he made this banner, and it commemorates people-to-people interaction. I'll let Ken explain a little bit between Drakewell and Japan. So Ken, you know a little of the details of this.
Thank you, Andrew. So it says people-to-people Izumozaki. Izumozaki is a town in Niigata province, which is on the Sea of Japan, facing the Korean peninsula. And it says Drakewell, 1859, and over here it says Meiji 23. Meiji 23 is the 23rd year of the Meiji era, after the Meiji Restoration, which is 1890. So 31 years after oil was found in Pennsylvania, oil started to produce in Japan. But Japan had known about the presence, Izumozaki had known about the presence of oil from 1873, but they couldn't extract it. And then finally they imported a machine from the US, and then when the rig arrived, they succeeded. And then they started to produce oil from 1890. It began, by 1898, 8 years later, they had 16 wells churning in Izumozaki for, I think, 1,070 barrels per day. After World War II, the oil production went down to about 30 barrels a year, and it was, for the longest time, the smallest producing oil well in the world, until the 1980s, when it stopped completely. But I'm very happy to be here with this connection. Thank you for having me, Andrew. My name is Ken Moriyasu. I will quickly introduce the panel because we don't want to, we're short on time. First online, Ambassador Jim Jeffrey, the chair of the Middle East Center at the Wilson Center, former ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and Albania. And to my right, Professor Brenda Shaffer from the Naval Postgraduate School, my friend of 20 years plus, formerly at Harvard and Haifa University. Mr. Raad Alkadiri from CSIS, also at BCG, IHS, and former advisor to the British ambassador to Iraq. And Dhahbia Al-Mohannadi, all the way from Qatar, assistant professor at Texas A&M University, and the Hamad bin Khalifa University as well recently. Great, so our session is we are the Drake Energy Security Forum, but we are the security part of the forum. And drawing from our conversation this morning, in the keynote address, Stephen Burns said that energy and politics are intertwined. Diana Furchtgott-Roth said that politics are full of surprises. And Mr. R.J. Johnson talked about how a Trump presidency may reform rather than repeal IRA. And Mr. Nick DeLuyos said Russia strengthened its hold on Europe through Europe's restrictions on emissions. So, as we know, as we've been hearing, politics really has influence on energy policy. So to begin with, last year we met here on October 13th, which was actually just 6 days after the October 7th Hamas assault on Israel. And we were talking about what the implications were. And back then, we were saying, this is probably Iran and Hamas trying to block the normalization of Israel and Saudi Arabia. 1 year later, we see quite a bit of development, and I think this is going to change quite a bit. This is my personal view, but I think, yes, Iran succeeded in derailing the Israel-Saudi peace, but what it's going to get, I think, is that Israel is going to try to decapitate the Islamic rule in Iran and actually go for a peace treaty with Iran, but not the current system, but a post-Islamic Iran and Israel. So Iran managed to derail that Saudi process, but it's going to get something that it didn't want. We're going to talk about that later, but before that, we're going to start with Dhahbia, and we're going to talk about if all this geopolitics were not involved, what are the GCC countries thinking in terms of energy transition? And after we hear the state of Qatar's energy transition, we will all chime in and say, talk about the geopolitical factors that may derail it. But before that, let us talk about what has happened in Qatar in terms of its economy, its population, and the challenges it faces.
Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be with you in person. I've been here last year virtually, so I was on the screen. It's a wonderful place, and it's very interesting talks yesterday and this morning. So in Qatar, we're a hydrocarbon-based economy, as you all know, and you know us for exporting LNG. But before LNG, we actually were a very small nation that relied heavily on pearl diving. With the discovery of oil just before the Second World War. Then we had the oil production, and then up till 1984, we really began the production and the development of the gas project. So already had the transition of hormone. So we had to switch from oil exporting, where we used to, I believe it peaked at 2014, and now we're a LNG exporting country. We held the #1 place for a long time. But what's happening is very exciting things and development. I think there's a project on the North Field expansion of the original natural gas reserve that exports our largest energy for a long time. And this will come with the development will begin construction in 2025, but then it will be fully operational on some of the aspects in 2027. And alongside that, we have a lot of plans. So one of the first plans is, what do you do with the CO2 that would be coming out with the LNG production? So there has been plans on planning the carbon capture and storage project, and it's the largest in the region, and they already have begun doing that. Locally as well, they have reformed the system. We're looking into public transportation with a centralized grid that comes from natural gas. And there's also efforts on reducing the local CO2 footprint with now a fully operational solar power plant that covers around 10%. But just last month they announced that they're going to cover up to 30% of the grid powered by solar energy. That's to reduce the emission locally. There has been also some programs in terms of energy efficiency for buildings. Opposite to here, you heat, we cool, because it's very hot. So there has been some regulations as well of how to reduce the energy usage in buildings, and especially in residential, so you have less of demand of electricity. There has been also announcement of hydrogen-based projects, so the largest ammonia production. That would be blue ammonia with carbon capture and storage. And also, because the ammonia process itself would produce as well some CO2, some of it would be blue, but then some of the CO2 that would be produced would be used for utilization, and that could be producing urea, which is the fertilizer, and that could delay the release of CO2, and you can use it in agriculture. There has also been some efforts locally to invest in and conserve the mangroves. That's the only form of vegetation that we have that can be a carbon sink. It can grow in the sea, and it has a very large efficiency of reducing CO2. So that's also been an effort that's been done there.
Could I ask, but why does Qatar have to do these things? Qatar has a wonderful life. I mean, many of us were there last year,
yes.
And beautiful hotels, highways, a beautiful Islamic museum. Why is there such an effort to develop all these renewable sources?
Yes. So I think it's because we recognize that natural gas is a finite resource. At some time, it might deplete, but even though we have a lot of it, maybe the clients will no longer want to buy something that has a high carbon intensity. So it's sort of like anticipation what the market would need. We're starting to track our CO2 emissions, scope 1 and scope 2, and then trying to understand as well what the market would require. So I think we had our first delivery of LNG to Singapore with marked CO2, like seeing how much CO2 has been produced. And these efforts are done to be ready in the future. When the change happens, we're going to be part of the change, rather than waiting for the change to come and then having to respond. You need that development, you need that knowledge, you need that infrastructure ready when the transition happens.
All right, so we are going to talk about all the things that are going to disrupt Qatar's plans. So, Raad, we're going to go to you next. We talked about this a little bit over dinner last year. I felt that the neoconservatives in the George Bush administration had a dream of toppling Saddam Hussein, and once the leadership was removed, then democracy would flourish. It didn't exactly go like that. But I have a feeling that the neoconservatives, especially after the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and also the decapitation of Hezbollah, see a similar opportunity and maybe a chance to redeem themselves and to prove that their theory was right. Do you have thoughts on what Netanyahu feels right now and how he may have changed or may have not have changed since years ago?
Well, the Israeli Prime Minister hasn't called of late. I feel rather unhappy. His late night calls have been been missing. He said he's busy. Look, looking ahead, I mean, you touch on I think two different points. One is, can the Middle East be transformed? Is it about lopping someone's head off, or putting a bullet through their brain and suddenly everything looks better? And the second thing is, what's the trajectory of this war, and what's the risk of further escalation? And what are the consequences of that escalation, including on issues to do with energy transitions and energy? I think arguably the Iraq experiment, which was one that I was intimately involved in, showed the limitations of that kind of policy, in part because there was a very simplistic view as to what would be required to change the region, and the region is rather sophisticated, is rather complicated, and has a habit of reminding you of reality rather quickly. And I think there is a danger that we are going down that direction as well. The current crisis reminds me in many ways of 1982, and this is what we were talking about over dinner, which was when a security threat was used by a right-wing Israeli government to achieve broader and arguably messianic objectives. In 82, it was about destroying the PLO, invading Lebanon, destroying the PLO, creating a client state in Lebanon that would ally with Israel. It came at a time when you had removed Egypt from the scene with a peace treaty, and was about consolidating a dream of greater Israel. And this doesn't detract from the tragedy and the violence that was October the 7th. But the question is Israel pursuing a policy that is about establishing deterrence? Or does it also see an opportunity to transform the region in its favor, and part of that being a territorial vision, and having very little restraint on it doing so for the moment? And I would argue, and what we were talking about last night, is we're probably in that second phase, or that second option. So what we are looking to potentially is a war that does escalate, and that goes after not economic targets or anything else, but goes after political targets with a goal of ending resistance, both the resistance that is about the existence of Israel, but also the ending resistance to Israel's vision of its place in the region, its territorial area. And that is going to have ripple effects. There is a tendency to think that Arab governments are quietly supportive of that, that fundamentally you can come out beyond that and still have peace deals. And the reality is that the Palestinian situation tends to crop up. Now, absent mass population transfer, you're still going to have a Palestinian issue. The Israelis understandably have no appetite for a two-state solution right now, but that doesn't mean it's in their strategic interest not to address the Palestinian issue. And so fundamentally, we are going into probably the most dangerous period of this war, because it's the one that has the wider and more amorphous objectives, and one that becomes harder and harder to manage.
Fantastic. So, Brenda, about 2 weeks ago, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a video statement to the people of Iran, saying that we are not against you, we are against your leaders. And once this issue is solved, the people of Persia and the people of the Jewish people have had centuries of friendship, and we can be friends again. So let's start with your thoughts on that video message and what we can tell from that.
So I think we need to separate between, the diagnosis and the treatment. So finally, I think Netanyahu is and the Israeli government, and I think despite media attempts that love to make there's Netanyahu, this sort of personification of the policies, but the current post-October 7th policies of the government of Israel, I think, have very wide support. And even if you put in an opposition figure, you changed them, they wouldn't be fundamentally different. And this sort of attempt, the way we do, there's not Russia, it's Putin. It's not, it's not the half of America, but it's Trump. This sort of personification, I think, is a bit misleading about what Israeli policies are, what motivate them, and what would be their future. But for years, I think Israel has made a mistake that it's actually played into the Iranian policy of Iran using all its proxies. And so they attack ships in the Red Sea and raise global inflation by a point. They raise global shipping prices for oil and for LNG. They protect Iran's nuclear program, because you have 150,000 Hezbollah missiles ready to attack Israel. They keep Israel busy with terrorism and through the Hamas, right? But it never reflects directly on Iran. And yes, we are in a different stage. It is a more dangerous stage, but actually it's the only chance actually that the region ever has is actually if you stop Iranian support for its proxies or make it pay for its proxies, because you can't deter a terrorist group. A terrorist group likes when civilians die. They get all the world sympathy, they get more money, but a state, especially Iran, can actually be deterred, especially an oil producer, because it's so easy, just like whether it's through sanctions or military actions, it's very easy to target its nervous system. We don't have it in more diversified economies. And could you imagine the Middle East? Think of the Middle East if you didn't have Houthis. Just mentioning human rights. The situation for the average person in Yemen, with which, by the way, occupation government, not the legal government of Yemen. Could you imagine what Iraq would look like if we didn't have Iranian intervention there? What Lebanon, Syria, Israel, Palestine, what the whole region would look like, and what Iran would look like, what it would be for the people of Iran if they weren't under this oppressive government. So So first thing, the diagnosis that the way to, Naftali Bennett calls it the octopus strategy. You deal with the head of the octopus and not the tentacles. I wrote about 30 years ago an article that you should deal with the sun and not the sun rays. I think his metaphor is better than mine, but at least identified the problem in Hebrew media about 30 years ago. So identifying the problem that you have to deal with the center of the terrorism and a state, which is deterrable, versus all the tentacles. Where I disagree with Netanyahu and some voices in the United States right now is that the way you get rid of the terrorism is regime change. Why? One, you want to give the regime an out, meaning that you want to deter them and you want to stop them from supporting proxies. And the only way you're going to get them to do that without completely destroying them is actually saying you can still stay in power from external perspective, but you have to stop your nuclear program and you have to stop supporting terror. And second, we're not very good at regime change. Wherever the U.S. takes this big tanks and planes and stuff, it doesn't really spread democracy very well. We're really lousy at it. If you do no harm, I don't think we can do a good job. And I think specifically Netanyahu made a huge mistake by appealing to the Persian people and not the peoples of Iran. Iran is a multi-ethnic state. Persians are only 37% of the country. And basically in that one line, he knocked out what I believe is the only effective anti-regime movement in Iran, which is the ethnic minorities, Arabs, Azerbaijani Turks, Baluch, Kurds. They're the only ones that somewhat have feet on the ground to be organized, and he alienated them with that one sentence.
Yes. At lunch, you gave an analogy about the British.
Right.
It's like saying?
So basically, by appealing to the Persians instead of peoples of Iran, it's like saying if you're trying to bring regime change in the UK and you said we would like to appeal to the great English people, and then so the Scots and Welsh say, oh, well, what about us, right? Or I'm trying to think U.S. policy is not to deal with the minorities in Iran. They basically follow the line of the Iranian Persian community in the United States, which is very pro-monarchist, very pro, Iran's territorial integrity. And basically, could you imagine on the eve of the Soviet breakup, like we're having all these demonstrations, all these conflicts, and Washington decides, okay, but whatever we do, don't support the Lithuanians, the Georgians, the Ukrainians, don't let the ethnic card play. I mean, that's basically what we're doing in Iran, and it's a very poor policy.
All right. Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you for joining us. I want to first start about the Israel-Iran issue and the Israel-Palestine issue, I guess. The US has always been calling for a two-state solution. The two-state solution is dead in the eyes of many Israeli people. I want you to address that. Also, like Brenda said, regime change has really never worked in terms of American statecraft. Your thoughts on that? And then, sorry to have so many questions, but all this looks like that the US will be bogged down in the Middle East once again for the next foreseeable future, which for countries like Japan, where I'm from, is very worrying because we want the Americans to pivot to Asia. Successive administrations have talked about the pivot to Asia, but it has never happened. So your thoughts on those issues, please.
Wow. Anyway, thank you, Ken. It's good to be here. I'm sorry I'm not here in person, Andrew. Raad, it's good to be working with you again. I hope you're doing well. You seem to be. And I agree with you and everybody else's comments. First of all, energy is critically important to not just economies, but to waging war and thus to security. But because of the way energy, particularly oil and gas, and even with the great strides that Qatar and other countries are making, and particularly I just checked in the International Energy Agency, the huge strides that solar is making, fossil fuels will only drop from 80% to 73% by 2030, and of course the percent of that will be not coal but oil and gas will increase. And apart from the United States, much of the oil and gas is in war zones, Russia and the Middle East. We all know the statistics. I won't bore you with going through them, but I'll be delighted to if somebody asks me if I can remember, but it's pretty dramatic. So therefore, war has a huge impact, or the capabilities of war and security and military on energy supplies, and energy supplies in the reverse. Okay, I'm going to push back. I'll get to the two-state solution, but first I want to talk about Iran, the region, Israel, to pick up on Brenda's point. I agree that we're seeing a transformation. I don't think it will be in the kind of regime change, whatever sugar plums are dancing in Bibi Netanyahu's head or some of his ministers, a few people in the United States that I know and have worked with, because it is extremely hard, and it's something that bubbles up from below, as we saw in Russia in 1989 to 1991, and some other countries, not something you can impose usually from the outside, absent something like World War II with Germany and Japan, or in a very bad sense, and Raad and I were on the ground doing this in Iraq after 2003, the bad example that you don't want to repeat. However, something is changing here. Iran's march through the region, which if you look at it over the past 20 years, and I and many of you were on the ground watching it, has been extraordinary, mainly through proxies and one or another form of military or quasi-military, all elements of power approaches. Granted, the Iranians have a certain Muslim appeal, but it's mainly focused on the Shia minorities in the Arab world. And they do, as I'll get to in a second, claim to be supporters of the Palestinians, but it's an absolutely absolutist, essentially back to 1948 without any Jews, and therefore it doesn't have much real appeal in the region other than among some Palestinians. It's mainly military. The transformation we have already seen is of Iran's 4 military tools. It's major proxies, essentially the Houthis, the 3 H's, the Houthis, the Hamas, and Hezbollah. It's long-range missiles threatening Israel and U.S. bases throughout the region. It's short-range missiles and rockets threatening the Gulf oil states' infrastructure and the U.S. bases that, wisely or not, we have plucked all up and down the Gulf, and its potential to go nuclear. That's its military capability. Its conventional military forces are insignificant and geographically badly placed to threaten anyone. 2 of these have already gone. The proxies, for the moment, one is out of action, Hamas. The other one is not faring well, Hezbollah. And the second, the Iranian long-range missile threat, assuming Israel has enough air defense missiles in reserve, or America and Israel together, that threat has been largely contained or deterred as well. This leaves only 2 very risky things for Iran: going for a nuclear weapon or holding hostage the various installations, oil installations, American bases across the Gulf, which are within range of tens of thousands of Iranian rockets and missiles, which, unlike an attack on Israel, really cannot be defeated by air defense systems. What they can be defeated by is both political and military pressure, because Iran would be directly involved in both of these. It can't hide behind long-range firings. It can't hide behind its proxies. And I think that will create a pressure on Iran if the Israelis continue to not go for the home run, but go for a succession of, if you will, base runs with keeping America on board, which may or may not be easy with the next administration. Now, the one thing the Israelis do have to deal with is the Palestinians. And here, I don't like the 2-state solution because, while I believe that is the end state everybody should want, it's what the UN said in 1947 in General Assembly Resolution 182, which is the creation document of Israel, and established the idea of a Arab state in the former Palestine as well. And so it's an end state, but the point is, it's not Israel's business to do a Palestinian state. Legally and technically, Israel is occupying what was enemy territory in 1967 that it seized as part of a war that was launched by Arab states, including from those territories, against Israel, analogous to the Soviets in Berlin until 1990, analogous, frankly, to the Israeli forces in the Sinai until the late 1970s. That is legal, but it's legal only if the occupying power has some way that the occupied peoples, or the occupied state, or the occupied political entities, you can be flexible, can get out from under. The Russians or the Soviets had an answer, and eventually they got it, but they demanded a lot, including no NATO forces in what was formerly Eastern Germany. The Egyptians got their territory back, but they had to accept limited military forces in the Sinai and the presence of an American-led international combat force there. So that's the way of the international law that Israel, that we have to look at this Israeli occupation. Sure, we should support on a separate track, and it has to be related, an Palestinian state, as opposed to turning it back to Jordan or turning Gaza back to Egypt or other alternatives. But the onus is on Israel under real international law, not the fuzzy humanitarian law we've heard so much about this past year. Under real international adults law of war, Israel has to, Israel cannot legally occupy these territories forever. That's like Putin in Crimea. It has to have a security agenda that the Palestinians, they don't have to meet it, in which case they stay occupied, but they have to know what they have to do to satisfy Israel and be able to leave. So
We'll come back to
the three.
Yeah, we'll come back to Asia afterwards. I'm going to Raad now. Ambassador Jeffrey had a fantastic analogy about don't go for the home run, but I have a feeling that the Israelis see the opportunity for a home run here. The 150,000 missiles that Hezbollah had reportedly have been reduced to half, and Hezbollah is without a leadership. So definitely that deterrence from the north has been weakened. Meanwhile, over in Iran, if they do pursue the nuclear option, like Ambassador Jeffrey said, then it will be very difficult for Israel to take action. So many Israelis think that now is the time, now is the only time to take action. That is my first question. But also, how does Saudi Arabia look at this? It's a bit of a jump, but if you put yourselves in the shoes of MBS, for instance, how would he look at the situation, and what are his options?
Nobody has good options here. So if you're MBS and you're sitting there, your focus is fundamentally on domestic politics, domestic consolidation, and regional leadership. And nothing that's happening right now in the region helps that agenda. It puts you on the defensive. From the standpoint of a peace deal with Israel, well, it isn't a peace deal, for the standpoint of normalization with Israel. It's always called a peace deal. Saudi Arabia wasn't at war with Israel. From the standpoint of normalization, it makes it extremely tricky. And the more the war expands, the more tricky it gets, because the Saudis do have to live with the Iranians across the water. And the reality is that the Saudis are vulnerable to Iranian attacks, if only on their economic facilities. The Iranians reminded them that in 2019, and that message wasn't lost. Moreover, in 2019, there was no security guarantee that actually prevented that or led to any serious repercussions for the Iranians. So I think from a Saudi point of view, you look at it and go, we need to provide top cover. And MBS has done that to a certain extent with his comments about a two-state solution. you look to be part of the solution, but do so in a much more cautious way, I think, than the Emiratis can, because the Saudis, say, have regional leadership ambitions and occupy a much more sensitive role in the region as a result of Mecca and Medina and as a result of various other things, no matter how much MBS is seeking to shift Saudi away from its Islamic identity. So everyone's in wait-and-see mode. I would argue the Iranians are in wait-and-see mode as well, and have been for most of the past year, in the sense of, what will the Israelis do, and what does the day after look like? And this is going to be determined what the day after looks like. And that's where it becomes potentially more destabilizing the more this war escalates.
What does this mean for MBS's energy policies? How does this affect its
I
plans?
think we talked about this last night. I don't think it does much for energy. I mean, oil prices fell to $74 a barrel for for Brent this morning, on the back of poor demand news from China. I mean, think about that. I mean, you have 17 million barrels a day of oil that goes through the Straits of Hormuz, and a war that appears to be expanding closer and closer to Iran. From an oil market perspective, from an oil market analyst perspective, you would say the closer that the war gets, the risk gets higher that you get engaged either directly with facilities being hit or some tit-for-tat reaction. And fundamentally, you have this massive supply of oil at risk, and yet the market is sanguine. The market certainly believes that it can withstand the loss of Iranian barrels, and is far more focused on the very short-term and bearish scenarios. So, this is one of those times where if you'd asked before, if there was a risk of the Straits of Hormuz being closed, people would say, $150 a barrel oil. $200 a barrel. Now, if the Straits of Hormuz is closed or there's damage to sort of oil facilities in Iran and particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, then that may happen. But right now, this is a market that's saying, we don't care. The fundamentals look pretty good, and actually, we don't think the price of oil should be that high. And so the risk premiums that's in the market is far less significant. So from a Saudi perspective, that actually brings you back to sort of what is the big challenge for MBS in the medium term domestically, and that is, how do you fund a transition that McKinsey and BCG write for you and says is all about diversification away from oil, but is founded on oil as a key revenue source to fund and allow that diversification? And how do you as MBS step back from what was a gloriously fantastic vision that you laid out of what Saudi Arabia was going to be by 2030 to a more realistic one, but one that means that an absolute ruler has to admit that they might have been wrong or miscalculated? And there are political repercussions potentially in terms of that sort of probably will be more on MBS's mind than arguably sort of the fate of the Palestinians or the fate of Israel.
Dhahbia, does this resonate with you, that the turmoil next door doesn't really impact the energy transition? We talked about yesterday, I asked, isn't this prospect of war between Israel and Iran going to disrupt all your plans? And I think your answer was, I don't think so. Could you tell us about how it feels sitting in Qatar?
Yeah, so what I do is basically I do research on energy transition, and I build models. And I sit down and I try to minimize any error that I can have my model working just fine, and then I analyze the results based on different scenarios. So for my perspective as a scientist sitting in my computer with my students, analyzing the different inputs, we care about how do you actually get your product out to the end client. And for that, you need to have a stable supply chain. I think that is a risk to supply chains. That's what I can, the max I can give you, that's a risk to disruption of the supply chain. But then it has, there's different areas where you can say that this product can go through the Hormuz straight, whereas other projects can be taken by plane, or you can have some land where you can have pipelines, and then you can have maybe some other things that can not disrupt the supply. But will that change the energy transition? It depends on like how ready is the world for the different energy perspectives. Like in Japan, for example, which is a huge importer of LNG, I think you have nuclear as an option, but then you have the safety aspect, which is a big aspect, especially with the Fukushima accident around 12, 15 years ago. So I think the world would still need like to produce, like each country would have to have diversity of like energy sources, but then still would rely on the region, I think.
Ambassador Jeffrey, this is a good leeway to Asia. One of the contradictions that I have asking you this, Japan wants America to focus on China, but at the same time, if America takes its eye off the ball from the Middle East, then the energy prices go up, and that really hurts everybody in Japan. So that's a problem too. So we want America to be everywhere. But could you talk about the prioritization that is necessary or maybe not necessary for America going forward?
Thank you, Ken. I failed to answer this the last time around, but what I want to do is to drive a big, thick, sharp stake into the pivot idea. It's the wrong word, it's confusing. Let me talk about what, in the strategic sense, pivots are. It's shifting your whole international alliance structure. Italy left the Central Alliance in 1914 and joined up with France and Britain, and that's why, along with us and Russia, they won the First World War and the rest of the 20th and 21st century. China pivoted from the Soviet bloc in 1972 and became a quasi-partner, if not ally, of the United States. That was the strategic pivot too. We're not talking about us pivoting from our alliances in the Middle East, which are significant and robust, to abandon them, because the only way we can have an alliance with the people in East Asia is to give those people up because they're hostile. They're not. They're all basically part of the same global collective security international order. I'm sorry. So you're not pivoting diplomatically. You're not pivoting militarily. And this goes beyond people who are looking at Asia. Even people who talk about all the time our presence, our policies in the Middle East, they live with the illusion that either A, we still have 250,000 troops, mainly ground troops, with all those costs and casualties in Afghanistan, Iraq, or in supporting bases around the Gulf, or we have commitments that might require us to flow in another 250,000 in the next 6 months, and therefore, militarily, we're stuck in the Middle East. We can maintain our alliance system and protect our partners and advance our military and other security and diplomatic interests, largely with the force of a few tens of thousands out of the 1.8 million active and reserve troops we've got in America, with the flowing in of highly mobile ships and airplanes, as we've seen over the last year. But those ships and airplanes can move very quickly to East Asia. East Asia is obviously, if there was ever competition, wars in both places, East Asia is by far the most important. China is the more serious opponent. Everybody gets that, so we don't need to pivot there. And in terms of, Tony Blinken or the president's, travel schedule, I'm sorry, maybe the president should have traveled more to Asia, but he only traveled to the Middle East twice, as far as by my count, in the past 4 years. So it isn't a question of pivoting one's attention away from the region. We can not only do both, we have to do both, as you mentioned, because Asia, including both China and our allies, are dependent upon the oil that flows out of the Middle East. If you cannot secure that oil and gas, increasingly, particularly from our partner in increasing world gas supplies, Qatar, you cannot sustain yourself, either our partners or China, in East Asia. So it is integrally linked. So forget the pivot. We can
Okay.
do both.
Okay, thank you. Right, so that kind of says, okay, maybe we should move with the energy transition. But there is a new development, Brenda, the axis of upheaval or axis of evil, this new collaboration between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. Nobody knows to what depth this alliance is, but from your perspective, what is the significance of these four countries coming together?
Right, so I want to talk about the significance and also the role of energy in this alliance. So for most of the World War II period, the United States didn't have any serious challenge to its strategic dominance anywhere and globally. And mainly each power on its own, whether it was Soviet Union, then Russia, China, Iran in a regional perspective, North Korea in a regional perspective, right? They could try to challenge, but they all had strategic weaknesses. So for instance, China's strategic weakness was its dependence on imported energy. So there was a limit to how far it could go, how far its ships could go. Russia and Iran were easily sanctionable, and so didn't have that manufacturing base in addition, right? But suddenly this alliance between Russia, China, Iran, North Korea solves all the problems. So China not only gets, uninhibited access to Russian and Iranian oil, but thanks to our sanctions on Russia and Iran, it gets it at a discount. So we're giving them a boost to their economy. Russia and Iran essentially are not sanctionable anymore because they have this big market called China. They have other ones, India is pretty much there too, but enough just having China, right? And they together make their own insurance companies, their own shipping companies, and so this whole idea that, so clearly that U.S. sanctions have no or very little impact on this alliance. And the opposite, we've glued together, let's say Russia and Iran are kind of fought a lot of wars, they're traditionally enemies. Soviet Union and China, and then Russia and China, they have a lot of disagreements, but we actually succeeded in helping these countries, put the glue together. Now, we're even taking it one step further, and we heard it from the last panel and maybe one before that as well. While these countries are now having the first formidable threat to U.S. strategic domination in the world, first real run for our money. I mean, we're seeing it. Could you imagine the U.S. Navy is not keeping the Red Sea open, is not keeping the Black Sea open? I mean, something that for all of the, not just since World War II, all of the 20th century, you could count on the U.S. Navy to keep the sea lanes open. And in fact, even our enemies like this. Even China used to be happy and let us bump around because it was dependent on global trade, right? So we're not even letting, we're running away from the Houthis, and everyone around the world is paying money for this, right? But this is just one of the examples, right? But we're voluntarily making our own electricity more expensive, less reliable, more dependent on our enemies for the inputs to this new energy system. We're doing this in the name of cutting CO2 and methane emissions, while that entire block of China, Russia, Iran, and obviously North Korea are not even hardly giving lip service. It's certainly on methane, not even giving lip service to a change, right? So all of our efforts will be moot, and we have to think about it. It's not, having more expensive and less reliable electricity is not just, oh, I got to put a sweater on, or I can't take that vacation next year. It is a national security issue, right? And if we become poorer because of that, we also can't defend ourselves. Like I said, we're already seeing it with the U.S. retreat from the sea lanes. And our enemies, I actually, like every author, have to promote your book, right? But our enemies, our adversaries in Russia, Iran, and China are seeing our energy vulnerabilities, and they're openly writing about how if they get to war with the U.S., they know, if it's plane to plane, rocket to rocket, it's asymmetry, not in their favor. But where they can get us is our energy supply lines, which run on civilian supply lines. So if our energy security isn't good, it affects our military. And also, they're looking at hybrid warfare, that the best way to demoralize the US and pull it out of a war would be to turn the lights out in Texas or New York or California. And you know what? It's so goddamn easy because we do not take, oh, sorry about the cursing. I just want to fit in, you know, we are making our energy systems more and more vulnerable. And it's not just economic vulnerability, it's national security vulnerability.
Right, thank you. So we have a few minutes. Any questions, anybody? Oh. Bob.
Terrific panel, thank you very much. A question for Raad and Brenda, you too, if you'd like to weigh in. Just with regard to this, we're waiting for the next round. Israel's going to respond to the Iranian attack. Maybe it'll be over after this exchange. Maybe there will be reciprocal attacks and so forth. And it's interesting, I'm interested in your views on how Saudi Arabia and UAE are preparing for it. Out of the corner of my eye, I see the Iranian, was it the foreign minister or foreign advisor, going to Riyadh and then Qatar. And I see that press reports of the Saudis don't want their airspace used and so forth. But then I see MBZ from the UAE come over to Washington, visit with former President Trump, I believe, or Bush, and kind of sign a security pact with the United States. So could you just talk a little bit about how you see the UAE and Saudi Arabia preparing for the fur to fly, if you will, in the region?
They're hedging their bets and hoping for the best. I mean, there's nothing in terms of MBZ coming to Washington and MBZ or the UAE talking to the Iranians that would be out of place in any, diplomatic or foreign policy agenda of anyone in that situation. In the absence of an absolute security guarantee, which the US cannot and will not provide, either country, then they are going to try and minimize the potential fallout, and that potential fallout comes from the Iranians. Neither the UAE nor Saudi Arabia has any influence over Israeli policy, and therefore you have to mitigate the risk of second-order consequences. And the risk of second-order consequences is that the Iranians attack you in response to punish the world, as opposed to continuing a tit-for-tat with the Israelis. And that I think is as far as they can take it. I mean, there's a whole bunch of very, very canny strategic minds in this room. If you were sitting in MBZ's position, what the hell would you do, given the factors that are there? And so I think that's where it is. So what they are praying for is quiet. They have kept lines to Israel open, particularly the UAE. And they have sought to mitigate dangers, political, security, and otherwise. And you know what? If oil hits $200 a barrel and takes a while to come back, and you're sort of 10 million barrels a day, or 9 million barrels a day, or 7 million barrels a day of exports is only off the market for a short period of time, then suddenly Vision 2030 might look a lot better. But I'm being facetious. But I think they are hedging their bets as any government sensibly would do with their foreign policy.
I'd like to string together a few things that have been said here in answering this question. So first, I think we're in agreement that the oil market is in a relatively good situation to handle some sort of disruption from Israeli-Iranian crossfire fires. And I think a lot of the media isn't getting this, that even all the gains that have happened over the last couple of weeks were already erased this morning on the reports, coming out of China. So sure, you might have a spike for a week or two, but also Saudi Arabia and UAE probably would rev up production to keep it somewhat moderate spike. You have 3 months now in between the U.S. elections and the inauguration, meaning where basically Israel has a window of opportunity. And Iran, that knows the United States very well, and that's one of the reasons why they're taking high risks with Israel, in my opinion, is they know the Biden administration has Israel on a leash. But in those 3 months, the dog might be able to get out. Third, you have an imminent Iranian nuclear breakout. So you want to preempt a strike before that happens. You know, so it's an historic opportunity for something to happen. Probably I'll take a risk probably after our elections, but you know, probably. But UAE and Saudi Arabia, maybe like different views on how they view. I agree that everything is just about hedging for them. But let's recall that their infrastructure, airports, energy infrastructure, you know, government buildings, were under a Houthi attack, meaning Iran attack, for years, including under the Trump administration. And the U.S. did nothing. We really let their infrastructure get attacked and attacked and attacked. The only country that actually took significant military action against the Houthis has been Israel. And I did note, if you notice, a big change even in Saudi rhetoric after the attack on the Houthi oil infrastructure. I mean, if there was sort of demonstration of concept, that at the end of the day, you know, who's going to get rid of the Iranian direct threat on Saudi Arabia and UAE? It's not even the United States, it would be Israel. And I would say just something we haven't talked a lot about at this conference, but it's one of your favorite regions. We're watching the Gulf between Iran and Israel, but watch also Turkey and Azerbaijan, also bordering countries that have a lot, I would say probably more to benefit from a change in Iranian power, and a lot going on there that is much more subtle and I think not looked into so much by the media.
Okay.
Hi, media.
Just one last one on Turkey. Thank you for giving my favorite topic. So Turkey is very important for Japan when it comes to China because Erdogan is trying to unify the Turkic states of Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. And if he does manage to unite all the Turkic states and Turkey becomes a regional power, then Turkey and Japan can be the bookends of Eurasia, and that would be one way to pressure China. So Turkey is very important to Japan. So with that, thank you very much. I think we are out of time. Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.